Welcome to the last lecture of the semester. Thank you all for being here. I'm Erin Saldine, and I teach one of the Ways of Knowing courses. And it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's lecturer, Debra Magpie Earling. By the time the semester is over, and I think for most of the classes this has already happened, you've been introduced to her work. Most of you are familiar with her creative nonfiction essay, and some of you have also read her short fiction. We are so lucky to have her with us tonight to talk about storytelling. A little background info. Debra Magpie Earling was born in Spokane and is a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead. She attended the University of Washington before receiving her MFA from Cornell University. She's now a professor in the English department and is the director of UM's creative writing program, the first Native American to hold that title. Perma read her first novel, received a slew of awards, and I'm going to read them all. The Western Writers Association Spur Award for Best Novel of the West, the Mountain and Plains Bookseller Association Award, WWA's Medicine Pipe Bearer Award for Best First Novel, a Willa Literary Award, and the American Book Award. Sherman Alexie said of Perma Read, and I quote, "This book was great in all its pieces. In totality, it's epic." And I can attest to that. When I read Earling's work, I'm amazed by its translucence. Things appear one way, and then they don't. Truth in Earling's writing is easily manipulated, easily misunderstood. Her characters turn to the natural world to seek veracity, but often, through repeated interactions with the rest of the world, they don't find it in time. Or rather, the truth that has always existed remains veiled, there but not there. And yet, despite this, and despite the often heartbreaking circumstances that her characters find themselves in, I always finish reading one of her works with a sense of profound unsettlement and strangely hope. This is the ability of literature to instill empathy in a reader, and for that we now have Earling to thank as well. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Debra Magpie Earling.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, good evening. Thank you. I'm privileged and honored to be here. I was thinking about those of you who have been studying my work through the lens of the natural world. And tonight I think I'm going to upset you a little bit because I'm going to talk to you about my work through the lens of the unnatural world, or the world of ghosts and spirits and all the places where my stories come from. It's kind of interesting to me that we talk about ways of knowing, and there's so many ways of knowing that are like silenced in this world and stifled. And it seems like all the dark and wondrous stories that seem to belie our understanding and knowing are sometimes the places where we can find our truest knowledge. And how do we know who we are and where we belong if not through our stories and where we come from? How do we succeed in the world without knowing who we truly are and embracing those stories? Stories have always called me to write and to tell stories. I teach a class that is really, I have a big class, a storytelling class, that embraces both freshmen and graduate students in the creative writing program, and actually students from all over campus. I've had media arts graduate students, I've had law students, I have biology students. I have all these students who come into my class and they have this they look at me kind of strangely when I tell them, we are going to be telling stories, all kinds of stories. And I believe that stories are not just limited to oral stories. Many people are musicians. Some people are artists and dancers, singers. However the story comes to you, I encourage students to really express themselves in different ways. And I think that stories are something that really indelibly defines us in this world. I think about my native identity, my identity as a Flathead Indian woman. I dropped out of high school at the age of 15. And I always tell my parents, I used to tell my parents when they were living, we must have been hillbillies because I married off at 17 and I wasn't pregnant. And I had a horrific life when I was young. I married an alcoholic. I was beaten. And I lost my ex-husband. I had to divorce him because I couldn't afford his debts. And he was the last person to jump off the Maple Street toll bridge in Spokane. They put up if you see the guard now, it's just Maple Bridge. And the overhead, they have a protective cover, and that was put up after he died. And I don't tell these stories to really shock and alarm you. I just tell you these stories because they're stories of survival and the ways in which we can not only survive, but continue to thrive. And I think, like, why is it that some cultures are resilient and can continue to find a certain amount of hope and security even when times are rough, even in times of poverty, even in times of alcoholism. And so I grew up in a storied household. We spoke of ghosts and hauntings and were haunted by death and difficult times as well as good times. I went to Catholic school. If you haven't had weird storytelling experiences, go to Catholic schools. We had one nun in particular who had an answer to all the great unanswerable questions we asked her. If we died, what age would we be in heaven? The answer was 33, the age of our Lord, which seemed like the oldest age we could possibly be when I was 12 years old. If our dog or cats died, would we see them in heaven? The answer was no. We would be surrounded by the overwhelming light of God, and we would have no need for anything else. It was a startling and profound and really ugly idea when I was 12, that forever there would just be this all-embracing light, like somehow you'd lost your mind. And I remembered, if we died when we were 20 and our spouse died when they were 80, would we recognize them when we saw them again? And once again, we were told, well, we would, because we would be 33 years old. It all seemed like such a nightmare when I was a child. And even now, it sounds a little nightmarish to think of my young nieces and nephews as being 33 years old if anything should happen to them in their young age. But I have grown up with ghost stories, and I have loved them as a child. There's a story in Mission, St. Ignatius. There's the old Indian ghost who lights the fire. There used to be a stove in the old church who lights the fire, and when parishioners are in the church and they're praying, she said to scare people, the fire like pops and hisses and is cold, doesn't do anything to heat someone up. And I grew up with stories. On the night my Aunt Louise died, she called out to my great-grandmother miles away. And when my mother returned home at the age of 16, she identified my Aunt Louise's body in St. Ignatius at around 4 in the morning on the night of her death, which was a long night into Christmas. And the sheriff picked up my mother at 16, and he drove her into, across icy roads. And it was deeply foggy that night, and he drove her into St. Ignatius. And my mother was always a scaredy cat. Like, she was always afraid of things, a little spooked by the idea of spirits and spooked by the idea that her sister had died. And she had a hard time believing that her sister had died since she had seen her just a few hours before. But the sheriff, they found that the funeral home was vacant, of course. There wasn't anyone there, with all the windows were closed. And and the doors were locked. And so the sheriff went around and rattled all the windows and rattled the doors. And he finally came to this window, and he was able to push it up. And he pushed the window up, and he saddled his hands, and he had my mother, my 16-year-old mother, step into his palm, and he pushed her up through the window. And it just so happened that that was the same room where my Aunt Louise was in state. There was a sheet covering her, and my mother saw at first her hair, and my Aunt Louise had like amazingly striking hair. She used a root that you can get down by the Flathead River, and you can pound that root until your hair, like when you put it on your hair, it becomes this really fiery red color. And my mother said she knew that it was her sister before she even like looked her way. She could feel her spirit in the room. But that night, my grandmother saw the ghost of my Aunt Louise, who came to say goodbye. And I was told this story since the time I was little. And I remember my mother waking us up in the early morning hours to tell us to listen so we could hear the owl calling. My mother's grandmother had awakened her and her sisters one night, and my mother distinctly remembered listening, the owl hooting, and then the owl speaking in Salish, "Li kukwitnu, li kukwitnu," calling out my grandmother's sister's name. It's kind of odd when you go to university, and having dropped out of college, I remember being told that I would never go to university, and that I always wanted to go to law school, and that I would never go to law school, and certainly not such a great law school as Gonzaga Law School. I remember I was told by the woman who was teaching me GED mathematics. And I fought to get to go to good schools. I went to the University of Washington. I entered with third grade level math skills. I didn't know how to divide. So my learning curve was not only steep, it probably tilted backwards. I had such a hard time and such wonderful teachers that I went from like not knowing anything to pre-calculus in like one semester. Really amazing teachers. I actually got higher grades in mathematics than I did in English, which is surprising to me because I was always told I was stupid in mathematics. I had teachers who actually said to me I was stupid. I remember in high school, the day that I left high school, this is something like the day that I left high school, I was 15. I was called into the office of the counselor, and she told me, I said I wanted to go on, I wanted to write, and she said, you know, the best thing that could happen to you is if you got married, because Indians aren't very bright. And I remember I got up from her desk, and I walked out the door. I just remember this freedom of just pushing through the door and saying, you know, I refuse to accept that. However, those kinds of ideas, when you talk about like ideas that inform our knowing, well, I remember being in the University of Washington and in this huge lecture hall with Professor Bridgman, who is this like incredible scholar, historian, and medieval historian. And I was looking down. I sat up in the top balcony. I was looking down at all these people, and I remember thinking, all of these people have cranial capacities that are larger than mine, and they're all smarter than I am. I remember thinking that it was such a hard and difficult thing to battle. But James Welch came to the University of Washington when I was a junior, and I decided to take a class from him, a creative writing class, and it changed my life. I started winning awards, and I started like moving up. I went from being just probably a normal student to being one of the top students at the University of Washington. And later I was accepted into Cornell University. And I don't say this, it sounds like bragging, but okay, I'll brag. I was the only student accepted in the MFA PhD program. I was the only one in my class. There was 2 people who were behind me, and there were 2 people that were 4 years behind me, and there was only like 2 people who were ahead of me, like came after me years later. So it was an incredible experience. But here's something that I think is really interesting about that experience is I couldn't talk about the things that were important to me. You can't talk about spirits, you can't talk about ghosts, you can't really talk about your culture because people will look at you like this. You probably had that before, you know, that kind of the pullback. But you know, here's the weirdest, most wonderful thing that happened to me at the University of Montana. I was teaching a large lecture class. I used to teach out of Native American Studies. I was teaching a Native American Women's Studies class. There was 68 students in the class. I remember distinctly. There was one woman, it was in the spring, it was around 9:30 at night. A woman was giving her talk, and everyone, it was like a room like this, and everyone in that old Jeanette Rankin Hall. And we were the only class up there when all of a sudden we heard this movement, like this rumbling. You could feel the chairs moving. And there's the one room next to the big hall which we were in that has a free moving chairs. And I kid you not, this astonished me because I hadn't talked to anybody about ghosts or anything like that, except in literature classes. But here we were in this room, this large room, and everybody heard this, the chairs moving, and felt it too. You could feel it in the floorboards. And then we heard a man, a male professor, and I still think this is the weirdest thing. We heard a male professor speaking, and his voice was boom, 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 boom. And the students were laughing uproariously. You could hear them, they stamped their feet, they were laughing so loudly that this woman said, I can't even hear. I just open this adjoining door and tell them to be quiet? And I said, go ahead, fine. But when she opened the door, there was so much noise, but when she clicked open the door, all sound stopped. And she said, Professor Earling, there is no one in this room. And I remember thinking, that's crazy. That's ridiculous. And then there was a student saying, please, 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 can we just go and look around? Can we just take a minute and go around and look? And so we searched the whole Jeanette Rankin from the top floor down to the bottom. There was no one in there. And the journalism building wasn't behind us. And I love it. There's always a skeptic. I love skeptics. I love, there's a guy sitting in the back and he's like, it's just a class in the LA building. The sound is just drifting. Don't go all crazy. We're like, yeah, okay. And then one student said, can I just run over there and check? Ran over there, found the janitor, and he said, is there a class going in session right now? And the janitor said, no, but I think there's a professor in his office back here. Was he making a lot of noise? Really strange. Really different. And I often thought, was that class so terrific that somehow it reverberates throughout time? I don't know. I still think it's peculiar and weird, and I still don't believe, it's not like I believe it or that I find some truth in it. All I can say is the world is a more mysterious place than we can possibly imagine. What are the stories that influence me? The stories of my mother's stories influenced me, and one story in particular has always haunted me. There was a man who lived behind my great-grandmother's house. My mother lost her mother from pneumonia at the age of 29, and her father left them. And so my mother and her sisters were left to the care of my great-grandmother. And there was this old guy who lived out in Perma. If you've ever been out in Perma, man, it was the middle of nowhere. It still is. I think it's even worse now. There's nothing out there. There's a railroad sign, miles and miles of rattlesnakes and sage, nothing really much. And old Mr. Volman was from the old country, lived behind my grandmother, who owned a big piece of land, and he wanted a wife. So he sent away for a mail-order bride from the old country. And everybody, he was a miser, the kind of person who stacks, who squeezes a nickel till it squeaks. And he had old, like, tomato soup cans and stacked up by the side of his house. I mean, as tall as this, and like mountains of grapefruit juice cans. And you go to his house, like even later, he was a very peculiar person. But so everyone thought that Mr. Volman would get a wife who was as big as he was, kind of a big-boned woman who could do a lot of heavy work. So everyone was waiting for the Mrs. Volman to arrive on the train. And everyone in Perma remembered her arrival. Because when Mrs. Volman, the woman who would be Mrs. Volman, stepped from the train, people thought she was as beautiful as an angel. She had platinum hair, the palest eyes. She was thin and tall. She was beautiful. She smiled at everyone. Men turned around and women knocked their hats off in their watching. My grandmother told the story of how Mr. Volman came, picked up his missus, put her in the buckboard, headed back to his place. And my grandmother said, well, just give him some time, you know. A week later, she went up to see Mrs. Volman and thought that the house would be changed, that there would be a woman's touch, something different. But when she saw the house, it was quiet. It was really quiet, and it was a very hot day. So my grandmother sat down on the porch, and she took out her thermos of coffee and poured herself some, and while she was waiting, she heard something from the back of the house. And then she heard screaming. My grandmother got up and ran around to the back of the house. And what she saw, she couldn't comprehend at first. Mrs. Volman was chained to a tree in the backyard. She had a bowl of water and some munitions for the day. She was wearing her nightgown. She had little shade. She had worn a circle in her pacing back and forth. She'd run the chain and then turn around and run the chain the other way. Her nightgown was ripped and torn. And she couldn't speak English, but my grandmother tried desperately to get her free. She went home, she got her axe, she tried to break the chains that were binding Mrs. Volman to no effect. My grandmother couldn't find Mr. Volman, so she walked into Dixon, which is a good number of miles, walked into Dixon on that hot day and begged the Indian agent to come and see what Mr. Volman had done to his wife. The Indian agent told my great-grandmother, I do not believe you. And even if I did, it's none of your business. And I want you to go back home and mind your own business. Mr. Volman kept his wife chained to the tree through a season, 3 seasons. She was there in the wintertime, she was there in the spring, and she was there again in the summer, and he impregnated her. And then he let her go. But she had become crazy. My mother remembers Mrs. Volman as an old woman, And she would wander the hills around Perma. My mother said it was like those stories in the movies where, you know, the woman with the electrified hair, the white nightgown, wandering the hills above Perma. And especially on full moon nights, and my mother said she would scare the crap out of us. Mrs. Volman would come to the screen door in the summertime, and she would press her face to the door and she would say, "Is Joey here? Is my Joey here?" And my great-grandmother would have to tell her that her son had died in the war. And then she would take her back up the hill to Mr. Volman. Mrs. Volman's favorite phrase was, "The whole world is crazy." I think about those people who suffer in this world and all the things that are hidden, all the stories of misery that are hidden. And somehow I'm called, I feel in some ways, to write those stories, to write about the landscape, that in some way saves us from some of the miseries in this world. I thought that once I kind of grew up that things would change or my life would change in some ways, but I remember when I first started going to community college, there's many hard stories. I feel called to tell the stories of women in particular. And I was working as a bus girl when I got married. At the age of 17, I was working in this really fancy hotel restaurant. And we had this regular who sat at the end of the counter, and I couldn't go in the bar, but I could take the receipts in. There'd been a young woman who'd been missing, actually a girl. She was 15 years old. She was a paper girl, and she was abducted from her route on North Division. It was said that she was boyish. She used to put her hair in a hat so no one would trouble her, but someone took her. Everyone was talking about her. Everyone in Spokane was buzzing about this missing girl. And everyone was speculating about where she could be. And I worked, I worked long hours. I went to Spokane Falls Community College, and then at night I would bus tables. And then finally, some nights I got to go home early, which still wasn't early. And I remember turning in my receipts around 10, and there was a regular sitting there at the bar, at the end of the bar, and I turned in my receipts, and the bartender said, "Lucky you get to go home." And I said, "Yeah." And the man at the end of the bar said, "You know, it's a really terrible night. It's raining, it's dark, it's the bad part of town. Why don't I walk you down to your car?" And I had this quivering gut feeling that something was wrong. But I'm telling you, women, to pay attention to that gut feeling and don't be polite. I should have said something really nasty to this person because I felt like it, but I was polite. And I said, "Okay." Just then, one of the waiters came up behind me and he said, "Debra, you can't go. You've got all this work to do back here." I said, "No, I don't. And he's like, "Yes, you do." And like he said, "Come with me." And I started walking with him, and he goes, "That guy's a creep. It just gives me the willies, and I'm not, you sit in here, and here, I'll get you some champagne. Just sit there. There's a wedding going on." He said, "Just sit here." He goes, "I'm going to walk you to your car, then I'm going to drive you home afterwards, but you're staying until I get off my shift." I was like, "Okay." Who would ever guess, or who would ever imagine that this man on that night had that young girl, paper girl, in his basement, and she was strung up, and he tortured her for 2 weeks. He bit her in life and in death. He dismembered her body, and he put her in plastic sacks, and the community college that I used to drive to on the way, her body was found in that field. the same man who wanted to escort me down to my car. The world is a dangerous place. I keep thinking, like sometimes, like we all suffer indignities and pain and strife. But sometimes there are things that are just hovering around us, that haunt us, that are really close. I pay attention to those things. But not well enough, because when I went to Cornell, I had a similar experience, another dark experience. Really odd. This one was really odd. I was looking for a place. I'd been staying in international student housing, and I really wanted to get out of town. I wanted to stay out and ride I wanted to go in I wanted to live in a farmhouse, and I wanted to ride and have a lovely experience. And so one of the women that worked as a janitor in our building told me, my brother is looking for someone to rent his upstairs. He's got a beautiful farmhouse. You should go see him. And I felt creeped out by it, but I was like, okay. My mother was a housekeeper. I didn't want to be snotty at Cornell. There were too many snotty people, believe me, at Cornell. Really snotty people. And so I said, okay, I'll go check it out. And so she said, well, take some boxes because you're going to love this place. It's like, okay. So I get to this house, and so it is beautiful. It's this beautiful, elegant pink farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere, just corn stubble for miles and miles. And I thought, this is beautiful, really. And so her brother comes out, and he is not the kind of guy you want to greet you. He's one of those guys who looks green. He's got Vaseline hair, and he had this kind of deep grin. And he smoked a lot. And his face had that kind of yellowed creases, and he had this nicotine fingers, and he invited me in, come on in. And I'll never forget, he made me a cup of coffee. And he goes, I'll get those boxes for you. And he was like making his coffee. And I was polite. What was wrong with me? I should have gone, I've got to go. Sorry. I should have made for the door as quickly as possible. But like an idiot, I sat down. Sat down at his table, and behind him, I could see this big picture window. I could see the barn. I could see apparatus by the barn. And so he's looking at me, and he said, yeah, my wife left me about, 7 months ago. I was like, ooh, not good. I'm like early 20s. He's like pushing 60. He looks at me and he says, yeah, she left me for one of my farm hands. I was like, yes? He goes, yeah. He goes, see that corn chopper? And he was like smoking like this. And see that corn chopper back there? Can you see it on my shoulder? I'm like, yes. Well, he had a little accident with that corn chopper. I am not kidding. He said, it has a tendency to get stuck, and he kicked it with his boot, and it just pulled him right on in. And even when I was sitting there, who knows, speculation maybe, but I ask you, do you think he pushed his seasoned farmhand into the corn chopper? It's odd, peculiar. And I made my way out pretty fast, but I still had my stuff in there. So my dear father drives across all the way from Spokane, all the way to Ithaca. And then we drive out to this farmhouse, and my dad takes one look at it, and he goes, what kind of a numbskull are you? He goes, sit here, stay put. My dad looked like Paul Newman. Like women all over the country were kind of like, ooh, over my father. And so my father goes into the house. The guy comes out like he's going to welcome him. My dad didn't even shake his hand. It's like, where's my daughter's boxes? And he goes, oh, she's staying here. And my dad said, not over my dead body. My dad went up the stairs and got my stuff, and he said, lock the door. And my father rescued me. Ways of knowing. We have to trust the instinct that we have in this world. We have to trust ourselves and our vision. And we have to believe in ourselves. If you see yourself, I remember I was told, there's all kinds of roadblocks people want to throw in your way. I don't know whether it's family, whether it's teachers, whether it's, mean people. And they want to throw some roadblocks in your way. And you may have some friends like this, and sort of friends, frenemies. And you may have like family members who are a little bit dubious if you're getting any kind of degree right now. I certainly had that. I remember my family was like, how long are you going to be in school? You've been going to school forever. What are you going to do with that degree? Well, I'm going to think some. I'm going to write. I'm going to live a good life. I'm not going to care about the money that I make. I'm going to care about living and fulfilling my potential in this world and being a good citizen and loving others and being kind. The one thing that really troubles me now, and it really does, and the one thing that I'm committed to and that I want to see changed is, I don't want to see students paying for their education the way that you have to pay for your education now. I want you to have loans and Pell Grants that are easy, not loans that cause you trouble, that wake you up in the middle of the night and worry you and your family. I want things to change for you. Stories are powerful, powerful vehicles to change our lives. And if I always tell my storytelling class, you may not think that stories are really a powerful thing, but I tell you, sitting in this room tonight, geez, it's almost 8 o'clock at night. It's a dark night. And you're all here, and you're studying, and you're working hard. And you have a dream in your head. You know where you want to go, and you're working hard to get there, and I believe that you will make it. But sometimes it's really hard to believe that you will make it. Sometimes it's hard when you come across those obstacles, when fear gets in the way, when darkness comes. There are people who want to be in your way. There are some scary people in this world. How do we save ourselves, and how do we keep our eye on the good things in this world? I've told you some pretty dark stories, so I want to tell you a couple of stories that will lift you, hopefully. In my storytelling class, I teach 5 weeks of ghosts, 5 weeks of monsters, and 5 weeks of stories of wonder. The ghost stories are kind of amazing. Sometimes people will tell some pretty good ghost stories, but those stories are usually about things that haunt you. What haunts you in this world? What follows you around? What stories do you remember? And monster stories can be real monsters, the monster under your bed, the hag at the foot of your bed, or your little brother. Stories of wonder, though. Stories of wonder are hard to come by, I think. But I think that in this room that you are stories of wonder. I'm going to tell you a remarkable and kind of crazy story. My mother was a very religious person. I will say that I am not. But boy, when she was alive, she had such a powerful, belief that she kind of brought you into the wind of her beliefs, like she was such a force. She believed in the Blessed Virgin. She had this apple tree in her front yard, this apple tree that my parents, they inherited this house from my great Aunt Edna. We had known this apple tree all of my life. This apple tree had been there for forever. And my mother used to have to go out, she stopped spraying the tree, didn't know what to do with all the apples, so these apples would get worms and they drop on the ground. My mother was constantly picking up these apples, and she kind of thought it was a miserable thing, and it was. When you'd go over, you have to grab the wheelbarrow and pull all these like sticky apples in and throw them into the field or go dump them. I mean, it was just an endless thing. And it was years my parents lived there. And it had always been that way. And I remember my mother looked at me and she said, "I'm done with this." I thought, oh, we don't have to pick up these apples anymore? My mother goes, "No, I'm going to pray to the Blessed Virgin. I'm going to pray to the Blessed Virgin that these apples are gone. Next spring, no more." I was like, yeah, okay, you've lost it. Like, this is, like, that's not going to happen, Mom. She goes, "Oh, yes, it will." So it was like, I drove in next year, spring. Of course, I visited my mom all, winter, and I always went to see her. But I drove in, and she came outside, and she was like, "Look." It's like, "What?" She goes, "Look up." It's like, she goes, and I did not see one apple in that tree. There was none. There was none on the ground. There was none anywhere. And my mother goes, "See, I told you." I was like, I don't know much about apples. If any of you know about apples and you're good with gardening and all that, please let me know. But that was crazy, very coincidental. The other thing my mother told me was, my mother, I don't know, maybe you have some grandparents now who are going, "I won't be around for very long and you'd better be good to me, or you're going to be sorry when I'm gone." You are going to be so sorry when I'm gone. One night my mom, I got stuck with my mother. It was like I drove over and I had this great apartment in Spokane that I used to go and write to. And one night I came over, it was around this time of year, and I wasn't feeling well, but my mother said, "Come on over, I got some soup for you." So I came over and I was eating my soup and it was snowing a little bit. And then it was snowing like crazy. And we were watching this movie, and I looked outside, and the snow was just unbelievable. And my mother goes, "Oh, you better stay. Just stay." I said, "Okay." And the next morning we woke up, and the snow was like unbelievably deep. My mom goes, "You better just stay." She goes, "Let's go to the liquor store and get some good food, and we'll invite everybody over. We'll get some booze. We'll make up, we'll have a good time." And I said, okay, that sounds fun. It was the last Christmas I spent with my mother. And my mother at night, she was told so many good stories, but my mother would tell me, "Now, I want you to know that when I die," she'd watched Oprah. And on Oprah, there was a young woman who had lost her mother, and her mother promised she would send her some red balloons. And I go, "Don't send me any red balloons when you die." My mother goes, "I'm not going to send you any red balloons." I said, "Send me the lottery tickets. Now that's what I want." She goes, "I'm not sending you the lottery tickets. I'm going to send you a hummingbird." I looked at her, "Have you spent summers in Montana, especially up on the Flathead? Hummingbirds are everywhere. They're like zzz." I was like, "That's not a good, I won't know. That's bad. That's not a good sign. Can't we come up with anything else?" And she said, "No, I promise you, I will send you a hummingbird." In April of 2009, my mother died. I had not called her. I was waiting to call her that morning. She had just gone into the hospital. I was waiting to call her because she wasn't an early riser. And my mother had told me that, she used to tell me that, she said, "When I die, I want you to know this. I want you to know this in your bones, that when I die," my mother had angels everywhere. Do you have grandmothers that have angels everywhere? They collect angels, and angels on the trees, angels on the thing, angels in the garden. My mother goes, "I'm protected by my angels, and my angels are going to come for me when I die. Angels will come for me when I die." And I'm going to, when you hear of my death, I'm going to be flying over Jerusalem. I'm like, okay, Mom, I believe you. And she goes, no, just remember that. And when I heard of my mother's death, I did think about my mother flying over Jerusalem. But that started to bug me about the hummingbird thing. It was like, okay, she's going to show up. She's going to give me a sign. She's got to. And so I bought hummingbirds everywhere. And the squirrels, the damn squirrels got on the hummingbird feeders and they chewed off all those little flowers. I had big birds rocking the hut. I was like, get out of here. And I looked for hummingbird everywhere. I'd go on campus. I was looking for hummingbirds. I thought, they're going to come to me. I'm just going to know it. I'll know it when I see it. She promised me. So my mother's birthday was July 19th. So no hummingbirds, nothing. And I sat outside, disconsolate, and my husband sat next to me and he said, yeah. I go, there's no hummingbird. I guess life, there isn't life. There isn't anything after death. It's just death. It's really, that's it. My mom just didn't show herself to me. And he said, well, you know, you loved your mom and she loved you, and that's good. And I go, yeah, but she's promised she would show herself, and it's her birthday. And I was crying, and it was dusk. And I kid you not, I just finished that sentence. And you know, when you hear a hummingbird, it has that, and this humming, I was like, it felt like, I felt like I was in a movie. I was going to be kissed or something. This bird comes like flying out of nowhere. And then this bird comes up right up to me, and it goes flick, flick. This hummingbird on my mother's birthday. And then it goes zit. And my husband turned to me and he said, I think you got your answer. Who knows of the wonders of the world, the mysteries that surround us? But I ask you to keep an open mind to things. Maybe one day you'll be able to solve those mysteries, go beyond the veil. Weirder things are happening, aren't they? So thank you for your kind attention. We have some time, so I could answer some questions if you have any for me.
So you talk a lot about other people's experiences with ghosts and ghost stories. I know in readings that you've had your own personal experiences. Can you stand up and yell?
You can do it. I know.
Are there any stories that you personally would feel telling about ghosts that you've experienced?
Oh, yeah. That I've experienced personally that have come to me. Yes, I used to work for the Salish Culture Committee when I was, I worked as on this burial register project. And I had so many ghosts that came to my, I thought I was losing my mind. I really did. I had this little log cabin up on the Flathead. And it's small. And anyway, so I'd go up, I'd be on these old, I don't know whether you're familiar with this, but a lot of the old Indian allotments were lost after the Allotment Act. Many Indians sold those allotments just so they could eat for a month. And so they sold them for very little. And they even sold some of the properties that had cemeteries on them. And they were like, so some farmer rancher up in Polson around by, up by Hot Springs, there's these old Indian graveyards. And they're surrounded by, sometimes they'll fence them off, sometimes they don't. The cattle get in there anyway. So I would spend my days, and I was actually looking for the grave of my Aunt Louise, because my mother was only 16 when she died, and there wasn't anybody who really remembered exactly where she was buried. And that was a strange experience when I found out. The man who came to another woman's side, when I worked for the Salish Committee, I had to go to the grave site when someone died, and there was a young woman who had been beaten to death by her husband. And they were burying her, Debra Oldhorn. And I remember one of my aunts came up to him and she said, "You may want to talk to this man here, because he will know where Louise is buried." And I went up and talked to him, and it turned out that he was a son of Dirty Butterfly, who was the medicine woman who she commanded the rattlesnakes. And her son had fallen, the character Baptiste in my novel, but her son had fallen in love with my Aunt Louise. And there he was. And he had like long white hair and this beautiful suit. And I came up to him and I said, "I'm looking for the grave of my Aunt Louise." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, Perma Red, I know where she is." And he pointed this, and I found her. And the weird thing was I went back the next day with a spray can, a paint, and my cousin, and I was going to, spray it and tie it up so we'd never forget where it was at. And when we came back, there was a circle, completely perfect circle of hawk feathers around the bedpost where she had been buried. And, but as far as ghosts go, I was followed home by ghosts. I had to have Clarence Woodcock, who was our spiritual leader at the time, come and bless my house. The most scary time that I had, one of my really good friends from San Francisco, a very sophisticated friend, who was in business, showed up. She wanted to come and visit me, non-Indian. She was wearing like a really cool suit, navy blue, elegant. She came to my house and she was like, we were talking, and it was getting late into the night, and I saw this light coming around the edge of the camera, and I saw it going, and it was like I had this big picture window, and I saw, and I kid you not, ghosts do look like what they had in the movies, at least these ghosts did, and they were looking in the window, and there was a man, Indian man with long braids, and a woman who had her hair in a kerchief, and a child, and I saw them, and I was like, I am losing my mind. Is it talking to somebody who's really educated and doesn't believe? She was telling me how she's so quaint that you like those things, that you believe in that stuff. I was like, I kept looking. She goes, "What are you looking at?" And I said, And she turned around, and she saw this is like the window. And she yelped, and literally, I thought she leapt over to where I was in like one bound. And I was like, "You're seeing?" She goes, "What the hell is that?" And she said, "I always wanted to be Indian, but not anymore." It was like vindicated finally at last. Like somebody else sees this. So if it's a hallucination, it's like shared with somebody who doesn't believe. But I had many experiences that summer, and oddly continue to have some experiences. Mm-hmm.
So especially within Native Americans, there's a strong connection with tradition or like the culture of the past. But for me, and I feel like probably a lot of people here, I'm like French and Irish and Italian, and I don't have that much connection with like my ancestors or their culture.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's a problem in a place like our country where there isn't as much identity within like their history or their ancestors?
You know what? I have heard that before, and I know those things to be true, but I don't think it's a problem unless you fail to gather the stories of your family, because only through the stories of your family will you really know who you are and where you come from. And too often people ignore the stories of their family. They kind of listen. You think you know your grandfather's story, your grandmother's story, your great aunt's story. You think you know those things or that you're paying attention. But I really ask you, because you're young now and you have people in this world who can connect you to the past in such incredible ways and can tell you things and know the genealogy of your past and know the living breath of a story. So when somebody passes a story down to you in the living breath and says, "I know this," like I think it's funny because I had not even within my family, but I'm talking about the people that you know and people that you connect with. One of my former poetry teachers, Nelson Bentley, his teacher, and I think about those degrees of separation, was Auden. So doesn't that sound like what? I thought, the way back in time, Auden speaks. But, he would talk about, and Auden said, but like an idiot, I didn't write the information. I was just like, it just bowled me over that he was talking about Auden, and Auden was his teacher. So what I'm saying is, in the briefest amount of time, life memories go. And they're so significant, and they're so important. And I've met Raymond Carver, if you've studied Raymond Carver, and shaken his hand, and I think about that's kind of sort of a phenomenal thing, or having known Jim Welch and that he was my teacher and my mentor. And those things you kind of take for granted, but even now, the people whom you know have stories that are phenomenal. If I had my druthers, what I would do is I would go back to school. I would go to film school, and I would go to folklore. I would go to a school that studied folklore, and I would delve into these incredible, powerful, amazing stories that are life-changing. But I ask that you do that and that you find those. I mean, Thanksgiving is coming up really shortly, and if you get together with your family, get an old tape recorder, and those old kind, and take it out, use your phone and get photographs and take pictures. You will never regret it. You will be the historian in your family, and life goes by in the blink of an eye. You'll be this age where your nieces and nephews and your children will say, "Hey, what happened?" And you will be the purveyor of that culture. We all have a unique and rich heritage and culture. We just sometimes don't know the stories. Story is culture. Any other questions? I think we're done. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.